Little MAGA girl was kicked out of Target by a leftist, but a veteran rushed in and shouted. The sterile fluorescent hum of the Target superstore, usually a sanctuary of suburban commerce and mundane comfort, had been transformed into a cold arena of ideological persecution. In the heart of the toy section, surrounded by colorful plastics and the cheerful branding of childhood, a scene of profound injustice was unfolding, freezing the blood of the few onlookers who dared to glance before hurriedly looking away. At the center of this storm stood the little MAGA girl. A child of no more than 8 years old, trembling in her delicate yellow sundress. She was the picture of American innocence, yet her small frame was currently shrinking under the weight of a terrifying adult fury. Her crime? Wearing a bright red baseball cap emblazoned with 4 white letters, a MAGA. To her, it was a gift from her grandfather, a symbol of the country she was taught to love. But to the figure towering over her, it was a declaration of war. The antagonist, a store employee whose name tag read Skylar, but whose demeanor screamed radical leftist enforcer, was a vision of chaotic rage. Her hair, dyed a violent clash of neon pink and electric blue, stood out like a warning beacon of the woke ideology that had consumed her worldview. Her face was twisted into a snarl of self-righteous hatred, her mouth wide open as she screamed vitriol at the weeping child. Veins bulged in her neck as she leaned aggressively into the little girl's personal space, wielding a black walkie-talkie in one hand, like a weapon of censorship, ready to call for backup to remove the intruder. The sheer volume of her voice shattered the store's atmosphere, replacing the soft pop music with the jagged edge of political extremism. The physical evidence of the assault lay scattered on the polished white linoleum. A red Target shopping basket had been violently overturned, its contents spilled as if they were hazardous materials. Among the debris were children's books with patriotic covers, stories of the founding fathers and the bravery of pioneers, now lying face down, treated as trash. Most heartbreaking of all was a small, stick-mounted American flag, the kind handed out at 4th of July parades. It lay crumpled near the employees' heavy combat boots, dangerously close to being trampled. The little MAGA girl stood amidst this wreckage, her hands balling into fists at her sides, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. She let out a wail of pure, unadulterated fear, a sound that should have summoned help from every corner of the store. Yet she was utterly alone. The shoppers nearby, paralyzed by the fear of being cancelled or labeled by the screaming activist, kept their heads down, scurrying past the aisle with their carts, leaving the child to face the wrath of the radical left gay. In solitary confinement, she felt a profound sense of abandonment. Where were her parents? Separated only for a moment in the next aisle, the distance now felt like miles. She was trapped in the shadow of this ideologue who was using big words like oppression, systemic hate, and safety violation to justify bullying a second grader. The girl didn't understand the politics. She only understood the hate being directed at her. She felt small, wrong, and terrified that the red hat she loved so much was somehow evil. The leftist's aggression was escalating, her gestures becoming wilder, her threats of expulsion becoming more concrete. It was a moment of total darkness, where traditional values were being screamed into submission by the loud minority. But unknown to the weeping girl and the raging employee, the balance of power was about to shift. In the blurred background of the aisle, past the rows of action figures and board games, a figure was moving. He was not looking down like the others. He was moving with a speed that defied his age, a blur of navy blue uniform and polished brass. It was the "we" veteran. He had heard the cry, not just the cry of a child, but the cry of liberty under attack. Though his body was aged, his spirit was forged in the fires of a global war against tyranny, and he recognized the scent of a bully from a mile away. He was rushing toward the scene, his cane tapping a rhythmic drumbeat of approaching justice, his silhouette growing larger and more imposing with every second. The little MAGA girl was alone, but she wouldn't be for long. The cavalry was coming. The atmosphere in the aisle shifted from tense to suffocating as the radical leftist employee Skylar decided that shouting was no longer enough. She needed to make a public example of this small political dissident. With the fervor of an inquisitor, she stepped over the spilled contents of the shopping basket, her heavy combat boots crunching sickeningly on the corner of a children's book titled God Bless America. The sound made the little MAGA girl flinch violently, her small hands clutching her elbows as she tried to make herself smaller, to disappear from the wrath of this ideologically possessed adult. Skylar didn't see a terrified child. She saw a symbol of the patriarchy and oppression she had been indoctrinated to destroy. "You think you can just walk in here with that hate symbol on your head?" Skylar spat, her voice dripping with a venomous mix of condescension and rage. "This store is a safe space. Do you understand what that means? It means we don't tolerate intolerance. Your red hat is an act of violence against every marginalized person in this building." The absurdity of the accusation that a 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress was committing an act of violence was lost on Skylar, who was now fully consumed by her woke crusade. She leaned down, invading the girl's personal bubble, her face inches from the child's tear-stained cheeks. "That man," she hissed, referring to Trump, without even deigning to speak his name, "is a monster. And by wearing his name, you are supporting racism, sexism, and the destruction of the planet. You are a little accomplice to fascism." The little MAGA girl sobbed harder, her chest heaving with hiccups. She didn't know what fascism meant. She didn't know what marginalized meant. She only knew that her grandfather, the kindest man she knew, had given her the hat and told her it meant she loved her country. It's just a hat," she stammered, her voice trembling and barely audible. "I like the colors. Please leave me alone." Her innocent plea only seemed to infuriate the leftist further. To Skylar, innocence was just a mask for privilege. "Ignorance is no excuse," she shrieked, straightening up and gesturing wildly to the empty aisle, performing for an invisible audience of her peers. "This is exactly the problem, the normalization of hate. We have to dismantle it at the root." With a sudden, jerky movement that made the girl scream, Skylar reached down and snatched the small American flag from the floor, the one the girl had been eyeing, hoping to rescue. "This," Skylar yelled, holding the flag up like dirty laundry, "this is just a piece of fabric used to justify imperialism. It doesn't belong in my section." In a shocking display of disrespect, she didn't just drop the flag. She threw it with force back into the overturned bin, treating the stars and stripes like garbage. The little MAGA girl felt a fresh wave of hot tears. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a deep, stinging hurt. She felt the heavy boot of the radical left pressing down on her spirit, crushing the joy she felt about being an American. She looked around desperately for a friendly face, for anyone to step in and stop this nightmare. But the few shoppers at the end of the aisle turned their carts around, terrified of drawing the employees' ire. They chose silence over justice, leaving the child completely isolated. Emboldened by the lack of resistance, Skylar moved in for the final blow. She pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at the MAGA etc. cap. "I'm giving you 3 seconds to take that offensive trash off your head, or I am calling security to have you dragged out for disturbing the peace and creating a hostile environment. 1. The countdown hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The Little MAGA girl was paralyzed. If she took it off, she was betraying her grandpa and admitting she was bad. If she kept it on, she was going to be thrown out by police. The injustice was absolute. The pressure was unbearable. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying up to hold onto the brim of her hat, a final desperate act of defiance from a child pushed to the brink. "Two!" Skylar screamed, reaching out her hand to forcibly remove the cap herself, crossing the final line from verbal abuse to physical assault. The tension snapped. The girl let out a final piercing scream of "Grandpa!" just as a shadow fell over them, a shadow not of tyranny, but of salvation. Skylar's manicured fingers were mere inches from the red brim of the little MAGA girl's cap, poised to commit the ultimate act of censorship when a sound erupted that seemed to shake the very foundations of the store. It wasn't a scream, but a command, a guttural, thunderous roar that carried the weight of history and the undeniable authority of the battlefield. "Stand down!" The command hit the aisle like a shockwave. Skylar froze, her hand hovering in midair, her entire body seizing up in instinctive reaction to a tone she had likely never heard in her life, the tone of a man who has led others into the jaws of death. She whipped her head around, her neon hair flying, her expression of arrogant fury instantly replaced by shock. There, blocking the end of the aisle, stood the Shuki veteran. He was a giant of history standing in a modern wasteland. Colonel Thomas Old Glory Sullivan, Ret, had arrived. He was dressed in his full Class A dress uniform, preserved in pristine condition since 1945. The deep olive drab wool was immaculate, the brass buttons gleamed under the harsh lights, and his chest was a blinding wall of colorful ribbons and medals. The Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with bronze service stars. He leaned heavily on a black cane, his knuckles white with the effort, but his spine was as rigid as a steel beam. His face, etched with the deep lines of 90 years of life, was set in a scowl of ferocious discipline. With a speed that defied his age, the colonel stepped forward, planting his cane firmly between the terrified little MAGA girl and the lush, radical leftist. He became a human shield, a wall of honor protecting innocence from tyranny. He didn't just look at Skylar, he looked through her. "Step away from that child, or by God, you will answer to me," the colonel growled, his voice low and dangerous, vibrating with a controlled rage that was far more terrifying than Skylar's hysterical screaming. Skylar blinked, her brain struggling to process this sudden intrusion of traditional masculinity and authority into her controlled environment. She tried to rally, falling back on her scripted ideological talking points. "So you need to back away. I'm enforcing store policy against hate speech. This child is wearing a symbol of white supremacy and oppression, and I am removing it for the safety of—" "Silence!" The colonel cut her off with a slash of his hand. "Do not dare speak to me of oppression, young woman. I landed on the beaches of Normandy. I watched my friends die in the mud to stop real fascists. I fought to destroy a regime that burned books and silenced children. Exactly what you are doing right now." He pointed a trembling finger at the MAGA hat still on the girl's head. "That hat is a symbol of political expression, protected by the very constitution I bled to defend. You are not a protector. You are a tyrant in a polyester shirt." The confrontation was electric. The few shoppers who had been hiding now peeked around the corners, phones raised, filming the clash between the woke-known establishment and the patriotic's past. Skylar's face turned a deep, blotchy red. She was losing control of the narrative. Her authority, derived from corporate handbooks and cancel culture, was crumbling before the raw moral authority of a man who had actually saved the world. She tried one last, desperate tactic, the threat of the system. You are creating a hostile environment," Skylar stammered, backing away but pointing her walkie-talkie like a weapon. I'm calling the manager. I'm calling corporate. You're going to be banned. You and this little brat are going to be all over the internet as bigots. We will cancel you." The colonel didn't flinch. He stood his ground, towering over the scene despite his hunch. "Call them," he challenged, his eyes blazing. "Tell them that an officer of the United States Army stopped you from assaulting a minor. Tell them that as long as I draw breath, freedom of speech will not die in aisle 4 of Target." Defeated, humiliated, and realizing she could not physically intimidate this man, Skylar let out a frustrated, incoherent scream. She glared at the Passanma little MAGA girl one last time with pure, distilled hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. "The world is changing. You can't protect her forever." With that final, ominous threat of future retribution, the leftist spun on her heel and stormed off toward the manager's office, eager to spin her web of lies and victimhood to anyone who would listen. The immediate physical danger was gone, repelled by the veteran's intervention, but the toxic cloud of her ideology lingered in the air. The colonel let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving his old body trembling. He slowly turned around to face the girl he had just saved. The silence that descended upon the toy aisle in the wake of Skylar's retreat was profound, heavy with the residue of the conflict, but rapidly clearing, like the sky after a violent summer storm. The Tukitau Wesid veteran. Colonel Sullivan stood motionless for a moment, listening to the fading sound of the radical leftist's angry footsteps. Slowly, the tension drained from his shoulders. He was no longer the thunderous voice of divine retribution. He was once again an old man, weary but fulfilled by the knowledge that he had done his duty. He turned his attention entirely to the little MAGA girl, who was still trembling, her small hands clutching the hem of her yellow dress, her eyes wide with a mixture of lingering fear and dawning hero worship. With a grunt of effort that betrayed the pain in his joints, pain earned in foxholes decades ago, the colonel lowered himself onto one knee. He brought himself down to the child's eye level, transforming his imposing height into a posture of gentle, grandfatherly care. He took off his own service cap, revealing his white hair, an act of vulnerability and respect toward the young citizen. "At ease, soldier," he whispered, a warm smile breaking through the stern lines of his face. "The enemy has retreated. You are safe now." The berserk little MAGA girl sniffled, wiping a tear from her cheek. She said I was bad," the girl whispered, her voice cracking. "She said my hat was hate." The colonel's eyes softened with infinite compassion. He reached out and gently placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "She lied to you, little one. That is what bullies do when they have no truth on their side. They use fear because they are empty inside." He shifted his weight and reached toward the overturned shopping bin. With hands that shook slightly from age, but moved with reverence, he retrieved the small American flag that Skylar had thrown into the trash. He brushed off the imaginary dust, smoothing the stripes with his thumb. "This flag," he said, holding it up like a holy relic, "is not a symbol of hate. It is the reason you and I can stand here today. It is a symbol that says you are free to be who you are, to pray how you want, and yes, to wear whatever hat you choose." He handed the flag to the girl. She took it hesitantly, her small fingers wrapping around the stick where the colonel's hand had been. As she held it, a spark of pride returned to her eyes. The colonel then reached for the brim of her red MAGA cap, which had been crooked during the scuffle. He adjusted it carefully, centering it on her forehead. "This hat," he continued, his voice firming up with patriotic conviction, "represents a movement of people who love this country. There is no shame in loving America. There is no shame in wanting it to be great. The people who scream the loudest about tolerance are often the most intolerant of all. Do not let their noise drown out your pride. At that moment, the girl's parents came running around the corner, panic etched on their faces, having finally been alerted by the commotion. They stopped dead in their tracks, seeing the uniformed hero kneeling before their daughter. The girl didn't run to them immediately. Instead, she looked at the colonel and gave him a shaky, brave salute, just like she had seen in movies. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I won't take it off. I promise." The colonel returned the salute, crisp and perfect. "I know you won't. You are the future. And as long as there are children like you who are brave enough to wear the red, white and blue, then everything we fought for was worth it." He stood up, groaning slightly, but with the help of his cane he rose to his full height. The few shoppers who had remained nearby, initially too scared to intervene, began to clap. It started as a single pair of hands and grew into a warm applause, not for the drama, but for the restoration of order and decency. The radical leftist. His attempt to shame and cancel a child had backfired completely. Instead of crushing the girl's spirit, Skylar had inadvertently forged it into something stronger. The little MAGA girl ran to her parents, who hugged her fiercely, thanking the colonel with tears in their eyes. As the colonel turned to leave, walking slowly down the main aisle toward the exit, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that in the battle for the soul of the nation, a small but significant victory had been won in the toy aisle of Target. The values of duty, honor, and freedom had faced down the screaming void of woke ideology and emerged triumphant. The narrative ended not with the girl in tears, but with her standing tall, holding her flag, wearing her MAGA hat, and smiling, a living testament that the American spirit is indomitable.